This was supposed to be my New Year celebration, but it changed my life forever. The snow was falling over the streets of Aspen, and I was standing there holding a champagne glass that I knew I was about to drop because the man standing across from me wasn't my boyfriend, but he was holding the keys to a secret that had been buried for 20 years. I thought this night would be about a countdown and a kiss, but as the clock struck midnight I realized my entire identity was a lie, and the life I had been living in New York City was just a beautiful cage built by people I didn't even know. Keep watching, because what I found in that mountain cabin changed everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. Stay tuned, because by the end of this story you will realize that sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who have been lying to you since the day you were born. Lily Brooks lived a life that most girls only saw in movies. Her home was a sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park where the morning sun hit the floor-to-ceiling windows and turned the marble floors into a sea of gold. She was 23 years old, tall, with flowing dark hair and eyes that changed from gray to blue depending on the light. Her parents, Mark and Elizabeth Brooks, were the pillars of Manhattan high society. Mark was a venture capitalist who could make or break a company with a single phone call, and Elizabeth was a former model turned philanthropist who spent her days organizing galas that raised millions for charity. Lily grew up in the middle of this whirlwind of wealth and power, attending the best private schools and traveling the world on private jets, but despite the luxury she always felt like a guest in her own life. There was a strange coldness in the Brooks household that Lily couldn't quite explain. Her mother was obsessed with perfection. Elizabeth would spend. Welcome back to Revenge Water Official. If you are enjoying the content and want to support the journey, then make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support helps Revenge Water Official grow and bring you even better videos every single day, so join the family today by clicking subscribe, and thank you for being part of the team. Hours critiquing Lily's posture, her clothes, and her choice of friends. Mark was more distant, a man who expressed his love through expensive gifts rather than words. If Lily was sad, he would buy her a diamond bracelet. If she was lonely, he would send her on a vacation to the south of France. They never talked about the past, and there were no photos of Lily as a baby in the house. Whenever she asked about her birth, Elizabeth would simply say it was a long and difficult time and that they preferred to look forward rather than backward. Lily accepted this as a quirk of her family's high-strung nature until the winter of her 23rd year. The plan for New Year was grand. Mark had recently purchased a massive estate in the mountains of Aspen, Colorado. He wanted to host a celebration that would be talked about for years. The house was a masterpiece of glass and cedar tucked away in a private valley surrounded by ancient pine trees. Lily was excited for the trip because her boyfriend Nathan was going to join them. Nathan was a rising star in her father's firm, and everyone expected them to get engaged soon as the private jet touched down. In the snowy wilderness, Lily felt a strange shiver go down her spine. The air was thin and freezing, and the mountains looked like jagged teeth against the gray sky. She felt a sense of foreboding that she couldn't dismiss as just nerves. The mansion was filled with staff and decorators when they arrived. Elizabeth was in a state of high anxiety, checking the vintage of the champagne and the placement of the white lilies that had been flown in from Holland. Lily retreated to her room, which had a balcony overlooking the dark forest. As she stood there watching the snow fall, she noticed a man standing at the edge of the woods. He wasn't dressed like a guest or a member of the staff. He wore a heavy, worn-out work jacket and a baseball cap. He was just standing there staring up at the house. Lily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Who was he, and why was he watching them from the shadows? She mentioned it to her father during dinner, but Mark's reaction was strange. His face went pale and his hand shook as he put down his wine glass. He told her it was probably just a local hunter and that she shouldn't worry, but for the rest of the night Mark was on edge, checking the security cameras and whispering to his head of security. On the day of the New Year party, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lily was getting ready in her room, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's cars. It was a deep midnight blue silk that shimmered like the ocean. She looked at herself in the mirror, and for a moment she didn't recognize the girl staring back. She looked like a doll dressed up for a play. She didn't understand. As she went downstairs, she saw the guests arriving in their furs and tuxedos. The music was loud, the laughter was forced, and the champagne was flowing like water. Nathan found her and pulled her onto the dance floor, whispering about their future and the house they would buy in the Hamptons. Lily tried to smile, but her eyes kept drifting toward the windows. She felt like someone was calling her name from the darkness outside. Just before midnight, Lily decided she couldn't take the noise anymore. She slipped out of the side door and walked toward the small stone chapel that sat on the edge of the property. She thought she would find peace there, but instead she found the man in the work jacket. He was sitting on the steps holding a small wooden box in his lap. Lily froze, wanting to run, but her feet wouldn't move. "You have your mother's eyes," the man said, his voice raspy and filled with an ancient sadness. Lily stepped Forward, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" she asked. The man stood up and stepped into the light that spilled from the house. He looked like a ghost, his face lined with years of hard work and sorrow. "My name is Thomas, and I have been looking for you for 22 years, Lily," he said. He reached into the box and pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of a woman sitting on a porch holding a baby. The woman had the same dark hair and the same stormy eyes as Lily. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, and she looked happy in a way Lily had never seen her mother Elizabeth look. Thomas explained that he was from a small town in Oregon, a place where people worked the land and looked out for each other. He told her about a woman named Sarah who was his sister and Lily's real mother. Lily felt like the ground was dissolving beneath her feet. She told him he was crazy, that Mark and Elizabeth were her parents, but Thomas shook his head. He told her about a secret agreement made in a hospital in Portland 2 decades ago. He spoke of a family who had everything but a child and a woman who was desperate and tricked into signing away her rights. He said that Sarah had spent her entire life trying to find Lily, but the Brooks had used their money and their lawyers to build a wall of silence around her. "They didn't just adopt you, Lily, they stole you," Thomas said, his eyes welling with tears. Lily wanted to scream. She wanted to call for the security guards, but deep down a part of her knew he was telling the truth. It explained the coldness, the lack of baby photos, the way her parents looked at her with guilt instead of love. As she stood there in the snow, the clock inside the house began to strike midnight. The sound of cheers and fireworks erupted from the mansion, but Lily felt like she was standing in the middle of a graveyard. Thomas handed her the wooden box. "Take this," he said. "Inside you will find the letters she wrote to you every year on your birthday. She died 3 years ago, Lily, but she never stopped loving you. She told me to find you when you were old enough to understand that the life you were living was a lie." As the fireworks lit up the sky, Lily saw her father Mark running toward them across the lawn. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. He saw Thomas and his face transformed into a mask of pure rage. "Get away from her!" Mark screamed, his voice cracking. He reached Lily and tried to grab her arm to pull her back toward the house, but Lily pulled away. She held the wooden box tight against her chest and looked at the man who had raised her. "Tell me the truth," she whispered. "Is he lying?" Mark looked at the box and then at Thomas, and in that moment the mask of the powerful billionaire crumbled. He didn't say no, he didn't call the police, he just looked down at the snow and said, "We did it for you, Lily, we gave you a better life." Lily felt a scream building in her throat, a scream that had been trapped for 20 years. She realized that her entire life, her education, her clothes, her boyfriend, her very name was a product of a crime. She wasn't Lily Brooks, she was the daughter of a woman named Sarah from a town she had never heard of, and the people she called parents were nothing more than strangers who had bought her. The first part of her life ended that night under the cold stars of Aspen. She didn't go back into the house. She didn't say goodbye to Nathan. She walked toward Thomas's old truck parked at the gate, leaving behind the silk dress, the diamonds, and the golden cage that had been her home. As the truck pulled away from the estate, Lily looked back one last time at the lights of the mansion. They looked cold and distant, like the eyes of the people inside. She didn't know where she was going, but for the first time in her life she was moving toward the truth, and the journey to uncover the rest of the secrets was only just beginning. The truck bounced over the frozen dirt roads as they left the glowing lights of the Aspen mansion far behind, and for the first time in her life Lily felt the weight of true silence. Thomas drove with his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded in a world that had suddenly shifted for both of them. Lily sat in the passenger seat, clutching the wooden box to her chest as if it contained her very soul. She didn't look back at the luxury she was leaving because all she could see in her mind was the image of her father Mark standing in the snow with that look of defeated guilt. It was the look of a man who had built a kingdom on a foundation of sand, and now the tide had finally come in to wash it all away. Thomas began to speak, his voice a low rumble that cut through the sound of the heater humming in the dashboard. He told her about the town of Silver Creek, Oregon, a place where the trees grew so tall they hid the sun, and where the air always tasted of salt and pine. He described Sarah, her biological mother, as a woman who could find beauty in a gray sky. Sarah had been a gifted artist who painted the landscapes of the Pacific Northwest, but she had fallen on hard times after her husband died in a logging accident. She was young, alone, and pregnant with Lily when the lawyers from the Brooks family appeared. They didn't come with threats at first, they came with promises of a life where the child would never want for anything. They promised Sarah that she could still be a part of Lily's life, that it would be an open arrangement. But the moment the papers were signed and the money was transferred to pay off her husband's debts, the walls went up. Lily listened as Thomas described the years of legal battles that followed. Sarah had tried to fight them, but Mark Brooks had used his vast resources to move Lily across the country and change her records. He made sure that every letter Sarah wrote was intercepted and every phone call was blocked. Thomas told Lily how Sarah would sit on the porch of their small cottage every year on Lily's birthday, lighting a single candle, and singing happy birthday to the wind. She never stopped believing that one day Lily would find her way back. As the miles stretched into hours, Lily began to open the wooden box. Inside were stacks of envelopes yellowed with age and tied with simple twine. She pulled one out dated for her 5th birthday and began to read by the light of the cabin lamp. The words were beautiful and filled with a raw aching love that Lily had never experienced from Elizabeth. The letter spoke of the way the flowers bloomed in Oregon, and how Sarah hoped Lily was dancing in the sunshine somewhere as they crossed the border into Utah. The reality of her situation began to sink in. Lily realized she had nothing but the clothes on her back and the box in her lap. She had left her phone, her credit cards, and her entire identity in that mansion. She was now a ghost traveling through the heart of America with a man she had just met, but she didn't feel afraid. She felt a strange sense of relief. For years she had felt like a fraud in the high society of New York, and now she finally knew why she wasn't a Brooks. She was a Weaver. That was her mother's name, Sarah Weaver. Thomas looked over at her and saw her crying, and he reached out a hand to pat her shoulder. "It's okay to be angry, Lily," he said. "They took something they could never replace, but they couldn't take your spirit, and they certainly couldn't take your mother's love. It survived all these years just waiting for you." The journey to Oregon took 3 days, and during that time Thomas told Lily everything he knew about her heritage. He spoke of her grandfather, who was a fisherman, and her grandmother, who could bake a blackberry pie that people would travel miles for. Lily felt like she was learning a new language, the language of her own blood. They stayed in small motels along the way, and Lily saw a side of the country she had never known existed. She saw people working hard and living simply, and she realized that money didn't buy happiness, it only bought a better quality of distraction. She thought about Nathan, her boyfriend, and wondered if he was looking for her or if he was simply worried about what the scandal would do to his career at her father's firm. She realized she didn't care either way. Nathan was part of the cage, and she was finally out. When they finally reached the mountains of Oregon, the scenery changed to a deep lush green that felt like a warm embrace. The rain began to fall, a soft misty rain that felt like it was washing away the dust of the city. They drove through small towns where everyone waved at Thomas's truck, and eventually they turned onto a narrow winding road that led toward the coast. The air grew colder and saltier, and then suddenly the trees opened up to reveal the vast gray expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Lily gasped at the beauty of it. It was wild and untamed, and it felt more like home than any penthouse ever had. Thomas pulled the truck up to a small weathered cottage that sat on a cliff overlooking the waves. "This is it," he said. "This is where she waited for you." The house was small but filled with light, and the walls were covered in paintings. Lily walked through the rooms, feeling the presence of the woman who had lived there. She saw a small easel in the corner by the window where the light was the best. There was a half-finished painting of a young girl standing on a beach looking out at the horizon. Lily realized it was her, or at least Sarah's vision of her. She sat down in an old rocking chair and let the tears flow freely. She felt the weight of 20 years of lies finally lifting off her shoulders. She spent the next few days exploring the town and meeting people who had known her mother. They told her stories of Sarah's kindness and her stubbornness, and how she never gave up hope. Lily felt like she was meeting her mother through the memories of others. One afternoon, while she was walking through the town square, she saw a newspaper at a local cafe. On the front page was a photo of her father, Mark Brooks. The headline read, "Billionaire daughter missing in Aspen kidnapping suspected." Lily felt a surge of anger. She knew her father was using his power to spin the story to make himself the victim once again. He wasn't looking for his daughter, he was trying to protect his reputation. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. If she wanted to be truly free, she had to confront the people who had stolen her life. She had to go back to New York, not as the dutiful daughter of Mark Brooks, but as Sarah Weaver's daughter. She talked to Thomas about it, and he agreed to stand by her side. They began to plan their return, but this time they wouldn't be hiding. Before they left Oregon, Lily visited her mother's grave for the last time. The cemetery was on a hill overlooking the ocean, and the wind was blowing hard. Lily knelt down and placed a single white lily on the stone. "I know the truth now, Mom," she whispered, "and I'm going to make sure the world knows it too." She felt a sense of peace settle over her, as if a hand had been placed on her head in a blessing. She was no longer a victim of a wealthy family's greed. She was a woman with a mission. She took the wooden box and the paintings her mother had left behind, and she and Thomas began the long drive back east toward the city that had been her prison for 20 years. The drive back was different. Lily was no longer the quiet, confused girl she had been. She was focused and determined. She spent the time reading the rest of the letters and piecing together the evidence of the illegal adoption. She found names of doctors and lawyers who had been paid off, and she realized that the corruption went much deeper than she had thought. The Brooks family had built an empire on lies, and Lily was the key to bringing it all down. She knew it would be a dangerous game, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. She was fighting for the memory of a woman who had never stopped fighting for her. As they approached the skyline of Manhattan. The lights looked different to Lily. They no longer looked like stars, they looked like the eyes of a beast. She knew that inside those tall buildings people were talking about her, wondering where she was and what had happened. She checked into a small hotel under a fake name and began to make phone calls. She reached out to an old friend from college who was now an investigative journalist. She knew that the only way to protect herself and Thomas was to make the story so big that the Brooks family couldn't bury it. She met her friend in a quiet park and handed over the documents and the letters. The truth was about to come out, and the world of the Upper East Side was about to be rocked to its core. Lily spent the night watching the news and she saw her mother's face on the screen next to Mark Brooks's name. The journalist had done her job and the story of the stolen baby was spreading like wildfire. The public was outraged, and the police were starting to ask questions. Lily knew that Mark and Elizabeth would be desperate now. They would try to reach her, try to bribe her, or try to silence her, but she was ready. She had the wooden box, she had Thomas, and most importantly, she had the truth. The final showdown was coming and Lily knew that her life would never be the same again, but for the first time she was the one in control of the narrative. The celebration of the new year had ended, but the celebration of her new life was just beginning. The hotel room felt small compared to the vastness of the Oregon coast, but Lily felt more powerful in those four walls than she ever had in her family's mansion. She watched the television screen as the news cycle exploded with the story of the Brooks family scandal. The images of her childhood home and the faces of Mark and Elizabeth were everywhere, but now they were accompanied by words like fraud and child trafficking. The public was fascinated by the story of the billionaire who had bought a child to maintain his image of perfection, and the outrage was growing by the hour. Thomas sat in the corner of the room checking his own phone and making sure his family back in Oregon was safe. He was the silent hero of this story, a man who had risked everything to fulfill a deathbed promise to his sister. The next morning the phone in the hotel room rang. It was the journalist Sarah who told Lily that Mark Brooks wanted to meet. He was offering a private settlement and a public apology if she would stop the investigation and drop the legal claims. Lily felt a cold smile spread across her face. She didn't want his money, and she certainly didn't want his fake apology. She wanted him to look her in the eye and admit what he had done. She told Sarah to arrange the meeting, but not at the Brooks estate. She wanted it to happen at the lawyer's office in the city where everything was recorded, and there were no shadows to hide in. Lily dressed in a simple black suit and pulled her hair back tightly. She looked like a woman who was ready for war, and in many ways she was. When she walked into the conference room, Mark and Elizabeth were already there. They looked older than they had just a week ago. Elizabeth's hair was perfect as always, but her eyes were red and she looked like she was holding back a scream. Mark was pacing the floor, his expensive suit. When she walked into the conference room, Mark and Elizabeth were already there. They looked older than they had just a week ago. Elizabeth's hair was perfect as always, but her eyes were red, and she looked like she was holding back a scream. Mark was pacing the floor, his expensive suit looking wrinkled. For the first time in his life, they both stopped when they saw Lily. She wasn't the submissive daughter they remembered. She was someone entirely different. Mark started to speak, offering her a trust fund that would make her one of the wealthiest women in the country if she would just sign a non-disclosure agreement and tell the press it was all a misunderstanding. Lily let him finish, and then she threw the wooden box on the table. The sound of the wood hitting the mahogany was like a gunshot. "I don't want your money, Mark," Lily said, her voice steady and clear. "I want you to read these letters. I want you to read every single word my mother wrote while you were busy buying me jewelry to make me forget I ever had a soul." Lily watched as Elizabeth reached out to touch a letter, her hand trembling. Mark tried to bluster, saying they had saved her from a life of poverty, but Lily shut him down. She told them that poverty was better than a life built on a foundation of theft and lies. She informed them that she had already given the evidence of the illegal payments to the district attorney, and that the clock was ticking. Mark realized then that he couldn't buy his way out of this, and the look of sheer terror on his face was the only payment Lily ever wanted. The meeting ended with Lily walking out of the room without signing a single paper. As she stepped onto the sidewalk of Manhattan, the air felt different. The city didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a playground. Thomas was waiting for her in the truck, and he gave her a nod of approval. The news of the failed settlement broke within the hour, and by the evening the authorities were at the Brookses' door. Lily watched from a distance as the life she once knew crumbled to dust. She felt a pang of sadness for the memories she had, but she knew those memories belonged to a girl who didn't exist. She was starting over, and this time she was the one holding the pen. Over the next few months, the legal process moved slowly but surely. Lily worked closely with the lawyers to ensure that the truth was documented for the public record. She didn't seek revenge in the form of a prison sentence. She sought the truth. She wanted the world to know who Sarah Weaver was. She used the small inheritance her mother had left her to start a foundation for mothers who had been separated from their children by the legal system. She wanted to make sure that no other woman had to Write letters to a child they couldn't see. The foundation became her life's work, and for the first time she felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with her last name or her bank account. She eventually moved back to Oregon, permanently buying the small cottage on the cliff where her mother had lived. She spent her days painting the ocean and her evenings reading the letters in the wooden box. She and Thomas became close, and he taught her everything he knew about the land and the history of their family. She learned that she had cousins and aunts and uncles who had been told she died at birth, and the reunion with her extended family was the most beautiful moment of her life. They didn't care about her money or her upbringing. They just cared that Sarah's daughter was finally home. She realized that wealth wasn't about the numbers in a bank account. It was about the people who stood by you when the world was falling apart. As the next New Year's Eve approached, Lily decided to host a small gathering at the cottage. There were no champagne towers or silk dresses, just a bonfire on the beach and the sound of the waves. She invited Thomas and the new friends she had made in the town. As the countdown to midnight began, she stood on the shore looking out at the dark water. She thought about the girl she had been a year ago, standing on a balcony in Aspen feeling like a ghost. She realized that the explosion of her old life had been the best thing that ever happened to her. It had stripped away the lies and left her with the raw, beautiful truth of who she was. When the clock struck midnight, there were no fireworks in the sky, only the stars that had been there for thousands of years. Lily felt a deep sense of peace. She wasn't a Brooks and she wasn't a victim. She was a weaver. She was the legacy of a woman who never stopped loving her. And she was finally free. She looked at her hands and saw the paint under her nails, and she smiled. It was the first time she felt like she truly belonged in her own skin. The new year didn't bring a new life, it brought the life she was always meant to have. She had lost a kingdom, but she had found herself, and that was the greatest victory of all. The story of the girl from New York who found her soul in the mountains of Oregon became a legend in the town, and Lily was happy to live a quiet life far from the cameras and the greed. She knew that the scars of her past would always be there, but they were no longer painful. They were just reminders of how far she had come. She had survived the storm, and now she was the one guiding others to the shore. As the first sun of the new year rose over the Pacific, Lily picked up her brush and started to paint. She wasn't painting a girl looking at the horizon anymore. She was painting a woman who had finally arrived. And as the colors filled the canvas, she knew that this was just the beginning of her real story. The ending of her journey wasn't a destination but a feeling of home that she carried inside her. She had turned her pain into power and her isolation into community. She had proven that even the most powerful lies cannot stand against the simple truth of a mother's love. Lily Brooks was gone, and in her place stood a woman who knew her name, her history, and her heart. She was no longer a piece of a puzzle. She was the whole picture, and for the first time in 23 years she was truly and completely happy. As she watched the light dance on the water, she whispered thank you to the wind, knowing that somewhere her mother was finally at peace too.